The story begins on the remote and quiet Tiantang Island, a place where not much ever happens. Recently, the peace of the island has been disrupted by the arrival of a mysterious figure, Lao Jin, a 60-year-old priest. Lao Jin isn't just any visitor. He was once a local of Tiantang Island but left more than 30 years ago to live in the United States. Nobody on the island had seen or heard from him for decades. Until now. When Lao Jin returned, he was not alone. He came back with his wife and a reputation that made the entire island talk. People say Lao Jin has been blessed with divine powers. He can communicate with God and possesses magical healing abilities. His biggest miracle, according to the rumors, is that anyone who drinks his blessed holy water can have their body strengthened and even be cured of all illnesses. Naturally, the news spread like wildfire. The poor and sick villagers of Tiantang Island flocked to Lao Jin's temporary residence every day, forming long lines, hoping to receive his holy water and find salvation from their pain. Among those desperate for help was Wang Yi, a 60-year-old female resident who had been almost completely blind for years. Wang Yi wasn't born blind. She had once lived a normal life, but 5 years ago she developed a brain tumor. Although doctors successfully removed it, the tumor had already pressed on her optic nerve for too long, leaving her nearly blind. Since then, she could only see blurry shapes with the help of special glasses. When Wang Yi heard about Lao Jin's return 3 days earlier, she became emotional and hopeful. She immediately asked her devoted nephew, Ake, to take her to meet the priest. The meeting between Wang Yi and Lao Jin was surprisingly long and private. They spoke behind closed doors for an extended period of time. What they discussed remained a mystery, even to Ake. But then tragedy struck. On the day Wang Yi finally received a cup of Lao Jin's holy water, she drank it in front of everyone. The crowd watched, waiting for a miracle. But instead of regaining her eyesight, Wang Yi suddenly collapsed and died on the spot. The shocking death caused panic among the islanders. Ake, devastated and furious, immediately called the police. The newly appointed police chief of Tiantang Island, Director Jieshu, quickly arrived at the scene with his team. He inspected Wang Yi's body and noticed something disturbing. Her gums were burned, suggesting she had been poisoned. His preliminary judgment was that Wang Yi had been murdered through poisoning. The holy water itself also seemed suspicious. Half of the cup was still there, and it gave off a strange, acrid smell. Jieshu ordered his team to collect the remaining holy water and the container it was stored in to send it for laboratory testing. After securing the evidence, Jieshu questioned Ake about what had happened. Ake explained Wang Yi's medical history and why she had been so desperate to see Lao Jin. He also mentioned that Wang Yi and Lao Jin had a private conversation 3 days ago, but he had no idea what they discussed. After Wang Yi's shocking death, the investigation intensified. Ake, still grieving, expressed his growing suspicion directly to Police Chief Jieshu. He believed the murderer had to be either Lao Jin, the priest, or Mrs. Jin, his wife. Ake's reasoning was simple but compelling. The holy water Wang Yi drank was prepared by Mrs. Jin herself. The cup was then handed to Wang Yi by Lao Jin personally. Nobody else had a chance to tamper with the water. The other residents who had lined up were all sitting 2 meters away, too far to interfere. But Lao Jin and Mrs. Jin both vehemently denied any wrongdoing. They insisted they were innocent and deeply offended by the accusation. Lao Jin refused to believe Wang Yi had been poisoned at all, claiming, before Wang Yi drank, 2 other residents already had holy water from the same pot. Even using the same cup, neither of them fell ill. How could the water suddenly be poisoned for Wang Yi? This was a strong point. If the holy water was truly poisoned, why was Wang Yi the only victim? During the questioning, Lao Jin also admitted something important. He and Wang Yi were indeed old acquaintances. They had gone to middle school together more than 35 years ago. But after Lao Jin moved to the United States, he completely lost contact with her and had almost forgotten about her existence. According to Lao Jin, 3 days ago Wang Yi suddenly appeared and insisted on meeting him privately. She wanted to talk about the past, about their school days together. Lao Jin claimed he only vaguely remembered her at first, but soon recalled they had once been close. This revelation intrigued Jieshu. After finishing the initial questioning of Lao Jin, Mrs. Jin, and Ake, he ordered his officers Lao Mo and Mei Gui to conduct a deep background investigation, not only into the deceased Wang Yi, but also into Lao Jin and his wife's personal history and social relationships. Jieshu himself went alone to Wang Yi's house. The house was quiet, sparsely furnished, and showed signs of a lonely life. Wang Yi had never married. Her parents had long since passed away, and her nephew Ake was her only living relative. She spent most of her time alone and rarely socialized with others. At first, Jieshu found nothing of value, no letters, no financial records, no suspicious items. But then something caught his attention. A diary from Wang Yi's teenage years. Jieshu carefully took it back to the police station and read through it that night. What he discovered inside completely changed the direction of the case. The diary revealed that when Wang Yi was 18 years old, she had fallen in love with Lao Jin. The entries described their school days, stolen moments, and deep emotions. Eventually, their relationship became serious. They even got engaged a few years later. But then, something happened that shattered Wang Yi's life. As the investigation into Wang Yi's death deepens, the truth about Lao Jin begins to unravel. Reports from the United States reveal that Lao Jin's so-called healing powers were nothing but a carefully crafted con. His holy water was nothing more than filtered tap water. The miraculous recoveries of some believers were simply the result of placebo effect, a psychological trick. Worse still, Lao Jin had spent years exploiting the faith of his followers, making money off their desperation, and hiring promoters to spread his reputation as a man of God eventually. His scheme drew public attention and ended in scandal. Facing exposure and legal trouble, Lao Jin abandoned his life in the United States and returned to his remote hometown, Tiantang Island, hoping to escape the past. But what was the scandal that drove him back? Police Chief Jieshu becomes suspicious when Lao Jin mentions his childhood friend Miller, the man he allegedly traveled to the United States with over 30 years ago. Strangely, when the police check the database for Miller's records, they find no trace of him anywhere. No bank transactions, no travel records, no government data for the last 35 years. Jieshu and Officer Mei Gui decide to investigate. They drive to Lao Jin and Miller's hometown, a remote fishing village that is nearly abandoned, scheduled to be demolished and turned into a resort. They find only a young man in his 20s guarding the empty village for the developers. The man swears he has never heard of anyone named Miller living there. However, the young man does confirm one thing. 5 days ago, Lao Jin returned to this village. Jieshu and Mei Gui search Lao Jin's old house but find no physical evidence. Still, something about Lao Jin's recent visit gnaws at Jieshu's mind. He digs deeper, calling neighbors and distant acquaintances. The neighbors confirm that Miller and Lao Jin left for the United States decades ago and never came back. But one neighbor shares a crucial detail. Before the trip, Miller and Lao Jin had a violent argument. The fight started after Miller found out about Lao Jin's engagement to Wang Yi, and he strongly opposed their marriage. This revelation makes Jieshu suspicious. What if Miller never made it to the United States at all? Piecing together the timeline, Jieshu develops a chilling theory. Miller may have been murdered by Lao Jin 35 years ago, before the trip ever happened. Lao Jin lied to everyone, claiming they had traveled abroad together. He broke off his engagement with Wang Yi, possibly fearing she would discover the truth about Miller's death. Miller's body may still be buried somewhere near Lao Jin's old home. If true, this would also explain why Lao Jin came back to the village 5 days ago. He wanted to secretly exhume Miller's body before the land was demolished and the remains discovered. Unfortunately for him, the presence of the young security guard forced him to abandon the plan. Jieshu becomes convinced. Wang Yi likely knew or suspected this dark secret. During their private meeting 3 days ago, she may have confronted Lao Jin about Miller's disappearance. Fearing exposure, Lao Jin decided to silence her by poisoning her holy water. To prove his theory, Jieshu organizes a search party with officers Lao Mo, Mei Gui, Bai Gu, and a police dog. They return to Lao Jin's childhood home. The dog quickly alerts them to a spot near the house. The team digs and soon uncovers a male skeleton. Forensic examination reveals the victim died about 30 years ago, was in his 20s at the time, and suffered a fatal blow to the head, clear evidence of murder. Although final confirmation requires Miller's dental records, all signs point to the skeleton being Miller. Jieshu immediately writes up a search warrant and raids Lao Jin's temporary residence on Tiantang Island. Inside, nothing incriminating is found, but outside, in the trash bin, investigators discover a half-empty bottle of dark liquid. Laboratory tests confirm the liquid contains a lethal dose of nicotine, the very same poison that killed Wang Yi. Even worse, Lao Jin's fingerprints are found on the bottle. This is the final piece of evidence Jieshu needs. Lao Jin is immediately arrested and taken into custody. Accused of 2 murders, separated by 35 years, the killing of Miller decades ago, and the murder of Wang Yi to keep the secret buried. When Wang Yi suddenly collapses and dies after drinking holy water prepared by the revered Jin priest and his wife, suspicion spreads through Paradise Island. Detective Jieshu and his team are called to investigate. Wang Yi's nephew, Ake, openly accuses the Jin priest or Mrs. Jin of poisoning Wang Yi, since they alone had access to the holy water. But the Jin priest denies the accusation, insisting that others drank the same water from the same cup and suffered no harm. Digging deeper, Jieshu uncovers a hidden connection between Wang Yi and the Jin priest. The two were childhood friends, even engaged decades ago. But 35 years ago, the Jin priest abruptly left for the United States and cut off all contact. Wang Yi's old diary, discovered in his house, reveals that he never got over the heartbreak. Soon, the investigation uncovers an even darker mystery. Rumors surface that the Jin priest left the U.S. because of a scandal, an incident where he was spotted on a date with another man, sparking outrage among his followers. Jieshu also learns about a man named Miller, a close friend who supposedly traveled to America with the Jin priest, but vanished from all records. No bank accounts, no travel history, no trace of life in 35 years. Jieshu begins to suspect the unthinkable. Miller never went to America, he was murdered. The Jin priest may have killed Miller decades ago, buried him near his old home, and fled abroad to escape exposure. When the police search the property, they uncover a buried skeleton. A young man killed by a heavy blow to the head, matching Miller's profile. Armed with this evidence, Jieshu obtains a search warrant and arrests the Jin priest. But just as the case seems solved, Mrs. Jin reveals a shocking truth. She was never really his wife. Their marriage was only a facade to hide his sexuality from conservative followers. She was merely his paid assistant. As Jieshu pieces the puzzle back together, another twist emerges. Forensic tests confirm that the skeleton is not Miller. It is the real Jin priest. The man everyone thought was the priest is actually Mi Lu, the Jin priest's childhood friend. Mi Lu had murdered the Jin priest 35 years ago, buried him, and assumed his identity ever since. Finally, Jieshu gathers all suspects at the crime scene. In a stunning reveal, he announces that Wang Yi was not murdered, he committed suicide. On the day of his death, Wang Yi secretly placed a plastic bag of nicotine in his mouth. When Mi Lu served him holy water, Wang Yi bit the bag, swallowing the poison and letting a small amount leak into the water. Framing Mi Lu for murder, Wang Yi's final act was a twisted plan for justice. Blinded by grief and betrayal after realizing that the man posing as the Jin priest was actually Mi Lu, the murderer of his former lover, Wang Yi sacrificed himself to ensure Mi Lu would be exposed and punished. Mi Lu is finally unmasked and arrested, ending a 35-year-old secret and bringing long-awaited closure to Wang Yi's tragic love story. When Detective Jieshu finally pieces together the clues, he gathers everyone, Mi Lu, posing as the Jin priest, Mrs. Jin, Ake, and his own team, at the crime scene for one last reveal. He shocks everyone by announcing that Wang Yi was not murdered, he committed suicide. Wang Yi secretly placed a plastic bag filled with nicotine in his mouth. When Mi Lu handed him holy water, Wang Yi bit the bag, swallowed the poison, and allowed some of it to mix with the water. Framing Mi Lu for murder, cornered by the evidence and by Jieshu's reasoning, Mi Lu's facade finally crumbles. In front of everyone, he takes off his disguise and confesses everything. 35 years ago, Mi Lu was deeply in love with his childhood friend, the real Jin priest. On the day of the tragedy, Mi Lu tearfully begged him to break off his engagement with Wang Yi and be with him instead. But the Jin priest, a man who truly loved Wang Yi, rejected Mi Lu. Blinded by heartbreak and rage, Mi Lu lost control and pushed the Jin priest down a flight of stairs, killing him instantly. To cover up the crime, Mi Lu buried the body in the backyard of the Jin priest's home. With no surviving relatives to notice his disappearance, the crime remained hidden. Mi Lu then used the Jin priest's passport to flee to the United States, where he began living under the priest's identity, building a new life and a following. For decades, no one knew the truth. But when Mi Lu was caught in a scandal at a bar with another man, he decided to leave the U.S. and return to Paradise Island. Fate dealt him a cruel blow. The village where the Jin priest's body was buried was scheduled for demolition. Fearing that the remains would be discovered, Mi Lu came back to secretly exhume the skeleton, but was stopped by the young guard watching the area. Although Mi Lu was not guilty of Wang Yi's death, he could not escape justice for the murder he committed 35 years ago. He is arrested, his decades-long deception finally exposed. This chilling case leaves everyone stunned, not just because of Mi Lu's crime, but because Wang Yi turned his own death into a weapon, choosing suicide as a final act of revenge to bring Mi Lu to justice. The narrator closes with a reflection. In cases like these, uncovering a murderer's hidden identity can be difficult. But what's even harder to predict is when a victim sacrifices themselves just to expose the truth.